It was an election that broke nearly every record in the book, and it is a result that will continue to reverberate. That electoral earthquake now opens the democratic path that will shape Scotland's future. And let's be clear, that future will be Scotland's hands, and it will be the people's choice, and nobody else.
For giving way, he mentions a record-breaking election. He hasn't mentioned, in fact, it was the Scottish Conservatives' record-breaking election with more votes for the Scottish Conservatives than at any time in the history of devolution, making us the definite party of the main opposition in Scotland. He talks about Scotland's choice, but 4 days before the election on Thursday, the First Minister of Scotland was on the BBC saying that this was not an election about independence. Barely hours after the polls closed, she was calling for another referendum. I asked the right honourable gentleman, why did she mislead the Scottish people 4 days before we went to the polls?
Answer that.
I have to say, I'm disappointed in the honourable gentleman, and I say to him that it's going to be important over the course of the coming weeks and months that we can debate properly what the choices are for the future of Scotland. And I make this offer to him, that all of us that have Scotland's interests at heart should be able to debate rationally and honestly what those choices are. Let's respect the electorate in doing that. Mr. Speaker, I think everybody knows that the Scottish National Party is the party of independence. And everybody knows, Mr. Speaker, without prevarication, without doubt, that the SNP stood on a very clear manifesto commitment of giving the people of Scotland that choice to have that debate and a say in their future. It was clearly contained within our manifesto that we said to the people of Scotland that put us back into government again, allow us to lead the country through the pandemic. But the promise that we made to the people of Scotland was that if they voted for us in that election, if they delivered a majority for independence in that Parliament, that nobody, not the Prime Minister, and certainly not the member for West Aberdeenshire, will stop the people of Scotland having their democratic choice. And I say to him that he has to recognise what happened. And let's look at this in the context that Westminster looks at it at, on the basis of the first-past-the-post system. Now, we don't support it. We support proportional representation. But, Mr. Speaker, there are 73 first-past-the-post constituencies in the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish National Party won 62 of them. We won 85% of the constituencies on 48% of the vote. The highest number of constituencies ever won by any party. The highest share of the vote ever won by any party. And for the Conservatives to try and argue that black is white, that they've won the election, if you listen to the honourable gentleman, then frankly, Mr. Speaker, nothing can be further from the truth. Because the truth is, the ambition of the Conservative Party in Scotland is to be in opposition. The ambition of the Scottish National Party is to govern and to take our people to independence.
If we're talking about victories and that, could he just add into his speech a little bit of a reference to Wales? Yeah. And in particular, the 19% swing to Labour from Plaid Cymru in the Rhondda, and the fact that Adam Price completely overplayed his hand. Nationalism is a false chimera. I suppose every chimera is false. He shouldn't put all his trust in one line.
Look, I say to the honourable gentleman that I believe the people in Wales should determine their own destiny. And of course, I congratulate the Labour Party in Wales in going back into government, because that is the right thing to do. But I say to this House, and I say to this Prime Minister, that we were told in 2014, when we had the independence referendum, that we would be respected in this House, that we were to lead the United Kingdom. And I say to the Prime Minister, and I say to everybody else in this House, that you cannot deny democracy. You cannot deny the right to the people of Scotland that have voted in 72 members of the Scottish Parliament that had a commitment of delivering an independence referendum. And I hear people saying 2014. But the point is, we were told in 2014 that if we stayed in the United Kingdom, then our rights as EU citizens would be respected. We were told that Scotland was to be respected. And we know what happened. In the Brexit referendum in 2016, Scotland voted by 62% to stay in the European Union. And we were simply told by this House, well, tough. There is nothing that we're going to do for you. You're going to lose that access to the single market. You're going to lose that access that you have craved. You're going to lose that right that you have had to work and live and get an education in Europe because the Prime Minister and the Conservative government are going to decide for the people of Scotland. Well, the people of Scotland have given their verdict on that, because the message is very clear that there is a mandate for an independence referendum. And let me put this House on notice that it's the people of Scotland and our Parliament that will determine when that independence referendum will take place. And just, I hear the mocking which is going on. But we didn't win. We didn't win. Can you believe it? You know what? We've just taken 2 seats from the Conservatives in the election. The seat of Edinburgh Central and the seat of Ayr. I don't know what you call winning, when by the Westminster rules you win 62 of the 73 seats. And by the warped logic of Conservative backbenchers, we haven't won. It's a parallel universe that the honourable member lives in, if that's what she believes. And if
I'm most grateful to the honourable member. I'm sure that he will join in me in wondering how this House will hold Welsh Labour to account in having moved its manifesto so much that they can talk about parking their tanks on Plaid Cymru's lawn. But Plaid Cymru made that lawn.
Well, I thank the honourable lady for that intervention, and hopefully the light that we have shone in Scotland gives an example to the people of Wales and Plaid Cymru that they should follow us and find their way back into Europe as an independent country. Mr. Speaker, putting on the record the scale of the SNP victory and achievement, putting on the record the verdict of the Scottish people, is especially important given today's context. Because today, this Tory government puts forward its policy programme for this new session. The Prime Minister gained the authority and the mandate to do so when his party was re-elected to office in 2019. Re-elected, I might add, with a significantly smaller vote share than was achieved by the SNP in Scotland last week. In that election, the Prime Minister put forward a manifesto with the policies he said he and his party would implement. Those of us on the opposition benches have the right to oppose many of these policies, and we will do so and do so forcibly. But if the Prime Minister secures a majority in this House, that mandate from the manifesto will be legally implemented. It is a pretty fundamental principle and should be simply a simple concept. It's called parliamentary democracy. And yet, Mr. Speaker, a few short days after a landslide victory in Scotland, it is that very basic principle of democracy, that right of governments to propose and implement their manifesto commitments, that this Tory government is threatening to undermine. By doing so, they are threatening a new level, a new low level of hypocrisy and of disrespect. The defeated Scottish Tory leader has said that the SNP seeking to implement a fundamental manifesto promise, a commitment to give our people a choice of our own future, should be treated as illegal. Before the results had even been completed, the Prime Minister himself told his favourite newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, that he would try to block a post-pandemic independence referendum. So, today of all days, I would genuinely urge the Prime Minister and his government to think again. I know he's looking away and looking disinterested, but this is important. Because this is about democracy, Prime Minister. This is about the rights of people. And you know, People will be watching this, and they can hear Conservative MPs laughing about our desire to make sure that democracy is deliverable. And that's the contempt, Mr. Speaker, that I have talked about. Let me say to the Prime Minister that any confrontation will not be with the SNP. If they seek to deny Scottish democracy, their confrontation will be with the people of Scotland. And secondly, the Prime Minister needs to reflect on this reality. A fight with democracy is a fight he will never, not ever win. You know, I know the Prime Minister doesn't want to see this, hear this, but he might try and show some degree of interest as to what is going on, because what we're seeing is the contempt that we have for Scotland from this government. Mr. Speaker, today's Queen's speech and this Tory policy programme also emphasises another important point. Last week's elections brought into stark focus the chasm in the political choices being made in different parts of the United Kingdom. Because the differing values and leadership between the Prime Minister and our First Minister, and the tale of two governments in London and in Edinburgh, has crystallised that choice of two futures. Time and time again, the majority of people in Scotland back a progressive, inclusive, outward-looking vision for the future of our nation. This has been our direction of travel since we gained some powers through devolution. And yet, in this Westminster Parliament, we are facing many more years of right-wing, Brexit-obsessed Tory governments that we didn't vote for, taking us in a direction that we haven't chosen. That clear divergence in political direction is simply not sustainable. Scotland has chosen a different path. And as we look beyond the pandemic and build the recovery, our alternative to these Tory values and their vision was set out in our manifesto. Unlike this Tory government, the SNP manifesto has the support of the Scottish people. The policy programme the SNP put before the people of Scotland will move our country forward, making it fairer, greener and more prosperous. The First Minister is already back at work and getting on with the job. Our alternative to this Queen's speech is already in action. With health and social care services being one on the front line of the pandemic, this new elected SNP government will now deliver a 20% increase in frontline NHS spending, a total of £2.5 billion. And while this Tory government dithers and delays on reforms to social care, the new SNP government will move to establish a national care service backed by a 25% increase in social care investment, while the Conservatives dither the SNP government in Edinburgh acts. And this will include significant investment in the staff themselves. And the Tories continue to laugh while we talk about investment in NHS. Because unlike the insult of a 1% offered by the Tories, in Scotland, NHS staff have been offered an average Prime Minister, of a 4% pay increase. And the new National Care Service, backed by £800 million, will enable the government to offer a national living wage to all care staff. It's little wonder the Prime Minister hangs his head in shame, and so, Mr. Speaker, so he should. To invest in the next generation, the SNP government will invest over £1 billion over the next Parliament to close the school attainment gap and to recruit 3,500 additional teachers and classroom assistants. You know, I don't think if the honourable member for West Aberdeenshire was back in school, he would behave the way he is behaving in this House. He really ought to calm down. This Tory government has to be shamed by a professional footballer into providing free school meals. In contrast, the Scottish Government will get on with providing free school breakfast and lunches to every primary school pupil year-round, and a device for every child in Scotland to get online. For families, the SNP Scottish Government will build a wraparound childcare system to help support working parents, with the least well-off families paying nothing. And whilst this Tory Government threatens to rip away the lifeline of a £20 a week uplift to universal credit, the new SNP government will double the game-changing Scottish child payment over the lifetime of their Parliament. That's a Scottish Government delivering on the people's priorities. Mr Speaker, the context of the COVID crisis makes the choices made now all the more critical. Because in seeking to build economic recovery in the aftermath of this pandemic, it is vital that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. Instead, though, the budget in March and this Queen's speech is clearly laying the grounds for more Tory austerity and more Tory cuts. And it is also important to point out that no party and no government who forced through a job-destroying Brexit in the middle of a pandemic can credibly claim to be focused on recovery. With the powers we have, the SNP Scottish Government is doing everything it can to mitigate against this damage and seeking to protect our businesses. We believe a fair recovery should follow the example of the Biden administration. It must be investment-led. At the centre of the SNP's recovery plans are an economic transformation which would have fair work and the climate emergency at its heart. This will include an investment of £500 million to support new jobs and to retain people for the jobs of the future, as well as funding the young person's guarantee of a university, college, apprenticeship, training place or a job for every young person that wants it. The SNP Government will also embark on a massive programme of capital investment. Over £33 billion will be invested over the next 5 years in our national infrastructure, directly supporting 45,000 jobs. And an SNP Government will deliver a further 100,000 homes by 2032, with investment of £3.5 billion over this Parliament, which will support 14,000 jobs a year. Mr Speaker, ahead of the COP26 conference in Glasgow in November, enhancing and expanding our world-leading climate action policies will be a key priority. The SNP Government will deliver a green transport revolution by providing free bikes to all school-aged children who can't afford them, remove the majority of fossil fuel buses from public transport, ramp up investment in active travel and bring ScotRail into public ownership with the aim of decarbonising the rail network by 2035. There is also a commitment to decarbonising the heating of 1 million homes by 2030. Mr Speaker, this is the vision and values we will use to fuel the recovery with the limited powers of devolution we now hold. But the COVID crisis has laid bare the need to equip our Parliament with the full powers it needs to drive our long-term recovery. If we are to fully build the kind of country we want to see, it is clearer than ever before that we need the full powers that we can only deliver with independence, powers to borrow and invest in our economy and in our people. Only then can we build the country that truly and fully reflects our choices, our values and our priorities. A country that lifts children out of poverty instead of wasting sums of money on yet more nuclear warheads. A country that gives our young people, instead of stopping their freedom of movement across the European continent, the ability to travel. A country that welcomes the world instead of imposing a hostile immigration policy that damages our economy. A country that respects and values refugees that were allowed to vote in our election last week, instead of proposing a law in this Queen's speech that will rip up the Refugee Convention. But, Mr Speaker, just as it's right to point out the opportunity before us, it is also right that we are honest about the risks to recovery if we remain trapped in a broken Westminster system. Because hidden in this new legislative programme from the Tories lies a familiar threat. Just as the Internal Market Bill was a blatant assault on devolution, this Queen's speech doubles down on that agenda with further power grabs on state aid and other aspects of devolved spending and powers. Only yesterday were more media reports of the UK government seeking to spend money directly in devolved areas in a desperate attempt to shore up support for the Union. The Tory plan has now been obvious for some time. Their plan is to hand this Prime Minister and his government more powers to control our choices and dictate our future. It is one more powerful reason for Scotland to choose a very different future. Mr Speaker, post-Brexit and post-pandemic, Scotland now has the choice of two futures. We know the past Westminster has imposed, and we now know the future that it will inflict. Westminster has chosen its future, a job-destroying Brexit, a return to austerity cuts and more attacks and devolution. Today's legislative agenda confirms and cements that choice. For Scotland, The choice over our own future is now ever clearer and ever closer. We have repeatedly said that our immediate priority is to steer people safely through this pandemic and to kick-start the recovery. We remain true to that commitment. But when this crisis has passed, there is now a fresh democratic commitment to give the Scottish people the right to choose an independent future. The Prime Minister would do well to listen to the First Minister. An independence referendum is now a question of when and not if. On these benches, we relish the opportunity, the debate and the democratic decision that now inevitability waits, and we look forward to Scotland rejoining the independent nations and the European Union.
We now come to